it's phase 3. I don't think I can assist on the particular date of that phase. It matters not because it's obvious it was in May that the
cases started rising mid-July. That's when I really started worrying.
Yes, but your statement says step 3 went too far as cases began rising again.
I see. Yes.
You also
subsequently
in July later expressed concern to the Prime Minister about the speed of release. Yes. I don't want to trouble you with the detail, but in this general debate about caution against speed of release,
yes,
you were for caution.
Yes.
To what extent were your concerns heard and reflected in the government's position thereafter?
Well, they were heard and they were reflected, I guess, in as much as it might have been more. There might have been more opening had I not made these arguments. My entire strategy at this point was to try to keep R below 1. I thought that it was I was completely alongside Chris Whitty during this period on this strategy, which was summer is the best time to release. If R goes a bit above 1 over the summer, not the end of the world so long as cases are very low, but then we'll have to take action in the early autumn to get it down again. But the critical thing is to keep it under control. And in this period, I articulated what I regarded as the government strategy, which was we suppress the virus until a vaccine can make us safe. Now, after articulating that a few times, I then got asked by Number 10 not to say it because we didn't know we'd get a vaccine. But I was confident by this point that we would get one. And anyway, I couldn't see any other way through this without far too many deaths.
When were you asked by Number 10 not to say it?
I can't remember. It was in a press conference. We should be able to find the paperwork if we dig further for it.
Just assist us roughly.
It will have been in a press conference in July or August.
Your statement says in terms that you believe that step 3 of the roadmap went too far, which tends to suggest that your concerns were not reflected in the outcome of that roadmap because step 3 had been promulgated. You thought they went too far, but it couldn't be reversed.
Well, certainly not fully reflected. But as throughout the autumn, the Prime Minister balanced economic and health considerations, and I made the health argument as well as I could. And this was an early precursor to the much more involved debates over September and October.
Do you recall ONS data being released on the 29th of July?
Yes, I remember that the number of cases bottomed out on the 13th of July, and I remember the ONS, which came out a little bit later but was more robust. The ONS survey would come out shortly after that.
The ONS data of that date showed, according to your statement, and it is, of course, right, that cases had risen, and to use your word, dramatically.
Yes, from a very low base, but yes.
Did you know in advance of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme?
No, that was announced not ahead of its announcement on the 8th of July.
No.
In fact, cases were still falling at that point.
Did you raise your concern when the scheme was announced? And of course, it was announced in advance of the beginning of August and meant to take effect on
3rd of August, I think.
Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays for those 4 weeks of August?
I didn't know about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme until the cabinet meeting on the morning of its announcement, and it was one of a package of loosenings. We were doing a number of things to bring back a bit of freedom over the summer.
As the Secretary of State for Health, had you been told and had you been asked for your view, what would you have said?
I don't know.
Well, Mr. Hancock, you've told the inquiry that there is in this debate between caution and allowing release, and it's a difficult debate, a public health view, which you as the Secretary of State are plainly on the side of caution.
Yes.
Because that's your job.
What mattered in the opening then was that there wasn't overall too much. And in the end, there was overall too much. Which individual items of opening you did or didn't do is second order compared to the overall amount of openings. I was at the same time campaigning internally to get funding so that those who tested positive would isolate, which we eventually got put in place in September. And I thought that was the most important use of money.
Did you express serious reservations about the scheme once you became aware of it, given your well-known position as Secretary of State for Health on the balance between release and positive promotion of eating out and caution?
Once it was announced, it was a done deal that it was government policy. I expressed caution and argued very strongly against its extension at the end of August, and I don't think its extension was ever seriously in prospect.
So you did argue very strongly against it, did you?
I argued that it shouldn't be extended.
It was a serious issue, though, was it not, in terms of the possible, and I'm not going to go into the debate about what the impact actually was in terms of prevalence, but in terms of at least the perception in intervention areas, it was a serious problem.
In intervention areas, it was unhelpful that the state should be subsidising people to go out at the same time as asking people to be more cautious.
It was serious.
Well, what I'd say is that I think there has been undue focus on this one item. And where the then Chancellor is absolutely right in his statement is he argues that this was not the sole cause of the second wave. What matters is
I've deliberately not asked you.
What matters was the overall, what Chris Whitty at the time called the R budget, the overall set of measures. My goal was to keep R below 1. If keeping R below 1 with a tighter set of measures elsewhere, but with this scheme in place, if that could have kept R below 1, I would have been happy with it. And if within the debate and negotiation, if it was easier to keep the Chancellor in a good place on other measures that were necessary in order to keep R below 1 as a whole, then tactically that would be something I'd be happy with. What matters here is the overall budget and keeping R below 1. In the end, that loosening was too much. Eat Out to Help Out was just one of many measures. And in effect, with hindsight, you can go through and you can look at 10 measures and say, we, in the end, could have afforded 7 of these. And whether Eat Out to Help Out is on that list or not is a moot point. That was the attitude that I took. I wanted to keep R below 1.
129458 is a WhatsApp from you to Simon Case. Just want to let you know directly, we've had lots of feedback that Eat Out to Help Out is causing problems in our intervention areas. I've kept it out of the news, but it's serious. This is you, Mr. Hancock.
Yes.
Have you told Rishi? And then Mr. Case says again, I don't think he can afford to extend it. And then you, yes, we've told Treasury. We've been protecting them in the comms, and thankfully it hasn't bubbled up.
Yes.
So the position you took was indeed that it was serious, that's your word.
Yes.
That you told the Treasury.
Yes.
But whilst you did so, you protected the Treasury in the news, you concealed your concerns about the seriousness of the impact of this scheme, and you expressed thanks, gratitude, it hadn't come to light.
That's because I abide by collective responsibility. And I was being encouraged by various journalists who would presume that I was against it to criticise the then Chancellor. But I believe that government is a team effort. And so I didn't want that to become a row in public. I mean, you can see during the whole pandemic the corrosive effect of leaks. I was not part of that, and I don't appreciate government by leak, and hence I abided by collective responsibility on and off the record. That's what I'm saying there.
As we are all aware, in the autumn, rates continued to go up, prevalence went up. There was a rule of 6 introduced. In the context of this debate between relaxation, promoting the economy, and caution and keeping R below 1, did the Prime Minister take a consistent approach to one or the other sides of that argument?
I think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister felt strongly the arguments for the protection of health and the arguments for liberty and the protection of the economy. My particular beef was that I didn't think there was a trade-off at all, and there wasn't. It wasn't an either or. You couldn't choose between either. And my intense frustration was that economists at the Treasury and elsewhere couldn't see that although you could protect the economy by not locking down this week or next week, the consequence, the second round consequence of that, would be a firmer, more economically damaging lockdown in the future. And as a trained economist and knowing some of them, the second round impact of a decision is what economics is all about. And I couldn't get them to see, it was deeply frustrating, that it was against the economic interest as well as against the health interest to avoid the action that was necessary. The Prime Minister saw it as both, and he felt very keenly the instincts on both sides.
In your book, for the 26th of August, it purports to be a diary entry, but we now know that these are not diary entries.
Not now, no. I was clear when I published it.
For all our best efforts to avoid chaotic lurching, the Prime Minister has veered off. Do you recall writing that in your book?
I do, and I remember that period.
Yes. So the answer to the question I put, which is, did the Prime Minister take a consistent line, is not that he was conscious of the debate, both sides, but that you used your efforts as well as the efforts of others to avoid chaotic lurching on his part. And the clear impression you give in your own book, Mr. Hancock, is that yet again he had veered off.
What period are we talking about?
26th of August.
So late August was frustrating because in July, the Prime Minister had been extremely concerned that there was a second wave, and it's reflected in the various communications, and then came back from holiday and was much more concerned with not locking down, and I found that a problem.
Mr. Hancock, they're your words. Chaotic lurching. That's not entirely similar to suggesting that he was reasonably and sensibly taking a different view in light of new information or scientific advice. Is it?
There are different degrees of diplomacy with which you can give an answer to the same question. The argument I was making then, sadly, turned out to be accurate, which is if you don't lock down early, then you have a tougher lockdown with more economic damage, as well as, of course, as the greater number of deaths and more damage to the health of the nation. And this is why I'm so emphatic about that being an important learning for the future.
Yes. And mindful of what you said yesterday, however, about the circuit breaker proposal in September, what you were calling for in September and October was a tougher local system, a proper and well-regulated or a more stringent tier system.
Yes.
Because that was what you assessed was the best way of avoiding the national lockdown. But you weren't calling for the circuit breaker specifically in September for the reasons you gave yesterday.
Yes, although I was also supportive of national measures to keep R down overall. And had we gone for a set of measures overall that would have kept R below 1, I would have supported that. My goal was to get R below 1. I didn't think the circuit breaker proposal would work in practice, but I could see the science behind it.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Because it was too short.
Because it was too short and the cases would just shoot up again afterwards. And it would risk losing public and parliamentary support. And I also, by this stage, there's a reference on the 8th of October to others are campaigning against us. By this stage, those arguing against lockdown in Parliament were formulating a group, they were coordinated, they were campaigning, and this became more of a problem later on. And so we needed to keep parliamentary consent and public support, and that was one of the reasons that I thought in practice a circuit breaker proposal wasn't the best way forward. With hindsight, would it have been better if I'd sat down with the scientists and said, okay, here are my sort of practical reasons I don't think your thing will work. You haven't come in behind my tiers proposal, but all of us care about getting R below 1. What should we together propose? But that isn't how it progressed. But I was arguing, as you can see, very strongly for action that was necessary to save lives.
You were, and as you explained yesterday, at the same time there was built into the system, perhaps a necessary part of any system for a national imposition of countermeasures, that delay between the second or third week in September when the tier proposal was first mooted and the 12th of October when it was announced. It took time in any event to get to that stage.
Well, it did, but it didn't need to take nearly so long.
No. In your witness statement, you say this: I was in despair that we had announced a policy that we knew would not work.
Yes.
That's the tier framework.
Yes.
And can you just acknowledge, and I'm just going to paraphrase what you say elsewhere in your statement about why the tier system didn't work.
Yeah.
You've just mentioned that the tier 3 level in the tier system wasn't strong enough.
Yes.
And you had in fact been blocked when you had tried to suggest a more stringent level.
Correct.
Secondly, epidemiologically, a system based on shifting tiers was always going to level up. And thirdly, you describe how the way in which there was a local negotiation with the regions which were placed into particular tiers, higher tiers, meant that there was a degree of negotiation, delay, confusion with what packages might be introduced, and then confusion for the public.
Yes, and sadly, this is how it played out. So when the announcement was made, the proposal was that under Tier 3, there would be a baseline of national measures, and then further measures would be agreed with local leadership. And when I say that I knew that wouldn't work, it was because local leadership had, up to that point, largely demonstrated that they were under significant political pressure not to accept measures. Now, there were exceptions to this. For instance, the mayor of Liverpool, Joe Anderson, not the mayor of the Liverpool City region, who I know has been a witness, Joe Anderson, unfortunately, no longer with us, he was incredibly supportive. And we ended up in Liverpool having a package of measures that was effective after a very constructive negotiation. And discussion, and in a spirit of collaboration. Despite, he was a Labour mayor. The parties, I don't know a single voice in the health and social care system who wasn't in favour of more action at that point, because we could see what was going to happen.
129555 is a WhatsApp communication between yourself and Simon Case, and you say in terms. And this is the 30th of October, Mr. Hancock. So obviously there is enormous debate and very difficult debate in government as to whether or not the second national lockdown should be imposed. I think it may be the second page.
I think we decided by the 30th of October.
Well, the reason I'm asking is you say Rishi is in the room, contrary to the stupid rules, so the Prime Minister will be under enormous pressure to not do enough once again.
Yeah.
And so given that that's the 30th of October, my question, in fact, is, was that a reference by you when you say to not do enough again, once again, the decision to make the lockdown?
Well, the stupid rules is that.
No, don't worry about the stupid rules.
Okay. But I was not allowed physically present into this meeting.
No, to not do enough again. That can only be a reference to the debate about the lockdown, presumably.
Yeah, so I'd been blocked from going into this meeting, and you can imagine who made that decision. The Prime Minister would be under pressure not to do enough. So repeatedly we had taken action, but it wasn't enough to get R below 1.
But on this day, the 30th of October, and you're aware, of course, that there'd been a forward strategy meeting in Chequers on the 25th of October.
Yeah.
The COVID task force had forwarded an advice seeking a lockdown on the 28th of October to the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And they'd presented a further paper again on the 30th of October. And then, as you'll recall, there was a further paper prepared for the COVID-O on the 30th of October. This can only be a reference to that debate which was going on the very same day about the national lockdown.
Well, around this time we did make the decision for a national lockdown. It may have been that this message was during the decision-making meeting. You can read it that way.
At the bottom of the page, Mr. Hancock, you say, I can live with that. That's a reference to a question about non-essential retail and secondary schools. But I'm very worried about a rearguard action that has screwed us all over too often. What was the reference to rearguard action? But what were you referring to there?
I was referring to the Prime Minister making a decision in principle to take action that was necessary to save lives, and then others arguing strongly against it afterwards. And I don't actually know who the others were, because I wouldn't have been party to those conversations. But that was something that we'd lived with.
And of course, as you explained yesterday, as the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, your primary concern, perhaps your only concern, had to be the public health clinical side of this terrible debate about the second wave bringing R below 1 and, of course, the damage to the economy and the societal harm that would be wrought by another lockdown.
Well, obviously, as you've seen from all of my evidence and all of the contemporaneous evidence, my primary concern was saving lives and making sure that we got through this with the NHS not being overwhelmed and as few people victim to this horrible virus. That was throughout the whole period, that was my primary motivation. And this inquiry has brought evidence that I didn't even know about myself that demonstrates the work that was going on with the health system as a whole that I led, and me obviously putting my voice to that. But, and this is a crucial point, as an MP, as a member of the cabinet, I didn't only care about the health interest. The importance of the economy matters too, and that would have been more damaged by delaying, and indeed was, because we had to have a tougher lockdown. And as I've said, I think if we'd managed to bring in an earlier lockdown, we may not have had to close schools second time round as we did, because the case rate got so high. We again in January had to pull every lever as we'd had to in March 2020. And so it is it isn't just that I was interested in the health outcomes. That was obviously my primary duty and my primary responsibility and my primary concern. But it's broader. My argument was broader than that. It was that even if you care only about the economy, you need to take the measures early, because there's absolutely no way we're going to allow R to be above 1 until case rates get to a position where the NHS is going to be overwhelmed, and that is always going to be the case until we have a vaccine.